Kiev is signaling a new kind of flexibility in a war that has hardened into trenches, drones, and long nights under air alarms. Ukraine's president is now publicly floating the idea of mutual troop pullbacks and a demilitarized zone in the country's east, tied to an updated peace framework being shaped with U.S. involvement. And in Washington, the White House is weighing what comes next, because the next steps may determine whether this becomes a real diplomatic opening or just another document swallowed by the battlefield. This shift comes as Ukraine and the United States move closer on a revised plan that Ukrainian officials describe as a working draft, not a final deal. The most important point is not that peace is suddenly within reach. The important point is that, for the first time in months, Kiev is describing a pathway that includes controlled withdrawals and internationally monitored buffer arrangements, provided Russia does the same. That is a high-risk bet for a country that has repeatedly said land cannot be traded for promises. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has outlined what he calls a 20-point framework, developed after weeks of talks with U.S. interlocutors. In public remarks, he described many positions as having moved closer, while acknowledging that the hardest questions are still unresolved. Two issues in particular remain the biggest obstacles: territorial control and the fate of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest, which sits near the front and remains under Russian control. The White House has not declared victory, and it cannot end. The American approach, as described by U.S. envoys involved in the talks, is focused on sequencing, timelines, and enforceability. That is diplomatic language for the grim reality that a ceasefire without a durable enforcement mechanism can simply become a pause, followed by a worse round of fighting. For Ukraine, the central fear is a frozen conflict that leaves Russia in control of captured territory, while holding the power to restart the war at a moment of its choosing. According to the outline released by Zelensky and details described by multiple reports, it begins with a reaffirmation of Ukraine's sovereignty. It then moves into a legally binding, non-aggression understanding, paired with monitoring provisions meant to detect and document violations. The concept being discussed includes advanced surveillance and early warning mechanisms designed to make it harder for either side to mask preparations for renewed offensives. Then comes the core bargaining chip for Kiev: security guarantees. Zelensky says the plan envisions robust guarantees from the United States, NATO, and European partners, described as mirroring the logic of NATO collective defense principle, even without formal NATO membership being promised in the framework itself. This is the heart of the argument Ukraine has been making for years, that any ceasefire without credible deterrence simply becomes an intermission. Another key detail is the size of Ukraine's armed forces. Zelensky has said the draft would keep Ukraine's military at its current strength of around 800,000 personnel. That matters because Moscow has repeatedly demanded limits on Ukraine's military capacity. For Kiev, keeping a large, capable force is not an ambition. It is a survival requirement, especially after years of fighting and repeated strikes on cities and infrastructure. The draft also sketches a political and economic horizon. Ukraine, in this framework, would move toward European Union membership by a specifically defined date and would receive short-term preferential access to European markets. On the U.S. side, the outline includes acceleration of a free trade agreement with Ukraine, tied to a broader prosperity and investment agenda intended to rebuild a country battered by war. And the scale being discussed is enormous. Zelensky has pointed to a target of mobilizing roughly $800 billion through a mix of mechanisms aimed at reconstruction and development. Even if that number reflects ambition rather than guaranteed funding, it signals how the negotiators are trying to package the end of the war not only as a ceasefire, but as a blueprint for rebuilding, investment, and long-term alignment with the West. There are also humanitarian pillars. The framework includes the idea of an all-for-all prisoner exchange, the return of civilian detainees and hostages, and the return of children. Those issues are emotionally charged, politically explosive, and often central to domestic legitimacy and wartime. For Ukraine, the return of people taken during the conflict is not a side issue. It is core to any claim that an agreement delivered justice. Then there is the political timeline inside Ukraine. The draft, as described by Zelensky, would require elections after the signing of an agreement. Ukraine has delayed elections under martial law during the invasion. Any move toward a settlement would inevitably reopen domestic debates over legitimacy, leadership, and the risks of political contestation while the country remains under threat. Now to the most sensitive element, territory. Zelensky has described this as the most complex, and it is easy to see why. Russia has demanded that Ukraine relinquish areas it still controls in the Donbas. Ukraine's position has been to stop the fighting at current lines rather than surrender additional territory. In the current discussions, the United States has proposed ideas that include demilitarized zones and a free economic zone in parts of the Donetsk region still held by Kyiv. This is where Zelensky's latest comments represent a notable signal. He has said he would be willing to withdraw Ukrainian forces from parts of the eastern industrial heartland if Russia also pulls back, and if an internationally monitored demilitarized arrangement is created. He has framed it not as capitulation, but as a reciprocal security step under external oversight. And he has added a crucial political condition, that any such arrangement would require approval, potentially through a national referendum. That referendum condition matters for two reasons. First, it underlines how politically perilous territorial and troop decisions are inside Ukraine. Second, it creates a time and legitimacy constraint. Even if negotiators align on paper, Ukraine's public and political system would still have to accept it. A deal that fails domestically can collapse before it ever constrains the battlefield. The second unresolved obstacle is Zaporizhzhia. The U.S. proposal described by Zelensky involves a consortium with Ukraine, the United States, and Russia, each holding an equal share, with the Americans playing a managerial role. Zelensky has rejected the idea of directly partnering with Russia in that way, arguing it is unrealistic after years of war. He has offered instead a U.S.-Ukraine joint venture model, with the Americans controlling their share of the output and potentially deciding how to allocate it. Why does a power plant matter this much? Because the plant is not only energy infrastructure, it is strategic leverage, a potential flashpoint for escalation, and a symbol. Control over it intersects with the question of sovereignty and the practical problem of restarting a complex facility damaged by war and tied to broader infrastructure, including water and grid stability. All of this was sharpened by the location and timing of recent talks. Over the past several days, U.S., Ukrainian, and European officials met in Florida, while U.S. envoys also held separate discussions with a Russian representative. A U.S. special envoy described those meetings as productive and constructive, and emphasized work on timelines and sequencing. That phrase should not be dismissed as diplomatic filler. It is an admission that the next phase is about who moves first, under what verification, with what consequences for violations. Russia's position for now remains opaque in public and hardline in substance. The Kremlin has said President Vladimir Putin has been briefed on U.S. proposals following the Florida discussions, and that Moscow is formulating its position. Russian officials have also indicated that they do not see European and Ukrainian efforts to amend earlier drafts as improving prospects, at least from Moscow's perspective. Putin has reiterated demands that include Ukraine giving up remaining territory in the Donbas and abandoning NATO aspirations. So the question becomes simple and brutal. If Ukraine is signaling conditional openness to a demilitarized zone, and the White House is reviewing next steps, will Moscow see that as a chance to end the war, or as a chance to lock in gains and demand more? The gap between those interpretations is the difference between peace and a pause. On the ground, the war continues to impose its own deadline. While diplomats debate sequencing, cities still face drone and missile attacks, infrastructure remains vulnerable, and front lines shift in small but costly increments. That is why every peace push is judged, not only by the words in a document, but by whether it can stop the killing, and whether it can prevent the war from restarting the moment one side rebuilds strength. For the White House, there is also a strategic and political dimension. Washington has been trying to bridge a split between what Ukraine says it needs for security and what Russia says it will accept. The U.S. role is not merely to convene. It is to propose enforceable mechanisms, align European participation, and decide what leverage, including sanctions and security commitments, is used to shape the outcome. For Europe, the stakes are existential in a different way. European leaders have insisted that Ukraine's sovereignty and future security cannot be negotiated away, and that any settlement must reduce the risk of a wider conflict. A deal that leaves Ukraine exposed could push future crises onto European borders, in refugees, energy shocks, and an emboldened Russia testing NATO resolve. And for Ukraine itself, the stakes are immediate. A settlement that stops the fighting but leaves parts of the country under occupation is not simply a geographic issue. It is about people, identity, law, and the precedent it sets. Yet a settlement that fails to stop the fighting is no settlement at all. Kiev is navigating between two intolerable outcomes: war without end or peace without safety. This is why the security guarantees language is so central. Guarantees are easy to promise and hard to implement. The difference between a political pledge and an operational commitment is everything. Would guarantees require immediate military action if Russia attacks again? Would they be automatic or conditional? Would they be backed by pre-positioned capabilities, intelligence sharing, air defense, and sustained support? These are not abstract questions. They determine whether deterrence holds. There is also a legal dimension in what is being discussed. The framework envisions a legally binding agreement with monitoring and consequences for violations, including the possibility of sanctions reimposed or intensified if terms are broken. Enforcement mechanisms are where most peace deals fail, especially when one party believes it can outlast the political will of guarantors. Then comes the idea of a peace council, described in the Ukrainian outline as being chaired by the U.S. president, with participation by Ukraine, Europe, NATO, Russia, and the United States. That structure, if it ever materialized, would be designed to keep all parties locked into the same room, politically and procedurally, so disputes do not immediately return to artillery. But structures on paper do not stop rockets. If demilitarized zones are created, the practical questions multiply quickly. How wide is the zone? How far do forces pull back? What weapons are prohibited? Who monitors? What happens if drones fly overhead? What counts as a violation? What is the response time? And critically, who has the authority to declare that a violation has occurred? International peacekeepers are one option often discussed in demilitarized arrangements, but that opens another set of problems. Which countries would contribute troops? Would Russia accept them? Would Ukraine trust them? Would they have authority to act or just to observe? History is full of peacekeeping missions that stabilize conflict, and history is also full of missions that could not stop determined aggression. Then there is the energy factor. If a settlement includes access guarantees for waterways like the Dnipro River and the Black Sea, as described in the Ukrainian outline, that intersects with global trade, grain exports, and regional security, ensuring freedom of navigation is not just an economic question for Ukraine. It is a global supply question tied to food prices and political stability far beyond the battlefield. Another element is what the outline calls educational and social programs aimed at promoting tolerance and reducing prejudice. That might sound distant from the front lines, but it reflects how negotiators often try to address the social scars of war, not only the military map. Whether such provisions are realistic or enforceable is another question, but their inclusion signals an attempt to define peace as a long-term societal shift, not merely a ceasefire. Still, the defining reality is this: Russia has not signed on to these terms. Ukraine has not signed on to all U.S. proposals, especially on the nuclear plant and territory. And the White House has not publicly committed to the exact form of security guarantees being described. So what we are watching is not a final agreement. We are watching a narrowing of possibilities and a test of whether diplomacy can outrun the next escalation. So what are the next steps likely to look like? First, a Russian response. The Kremlin has said it is forming a position after briefings from its envoy. That response could be a yes, a no, or a counter-demand. In past negotiations, Russia has often used ambiguity to keep pressure on Ukraine while extracting concessions. A carefully worded response that signals openness while hardening demands would not be unexpected. Second, leader-level engagement. Zelensky has indicated he wants direct talks with President Donald Trump to resolve unresolved points. That suggests the negotiations may be moving toward the stage where only top leaders can trade political risk for compromise. Those meetings, if they happen, will be framed as historic. But they will also be judged by whether they produce enforceable commitments, not photo opportunities. Third, Europe's role will likely be clarified. European leaders have pushed to be part of any guarantee framework, wary of a bilateral U.S.-Russia, understanding that sidelines European security. A deal that asks Europe to enforce outcomes without having shaped them would be unstable. So the White House will be balancing speed with inclusion and inclusion with coherence. Fourth, watch the battlefield. As diplomacy intensifies, both sides may try to improve their leverage. That can mean offensives, strikes on infrastructure, and pressure on key points. It can also mean a wave of information operations designed to shape public opinion at home and abroad. In the coming days, every major attack will be read not only as a military act, but as a negotiating message. Fifth, watch domestic politics inside Ukraine. If Zelensky continues to link major concessions to a referendum that sets the stage for a national debate under wartime pressure, even the discussion of elections after a deal is signed will raise questions about timing, security, and fairness. Any process that looks rushed or externally imposed could create internal fractures, and adversaries will exploit those fractures. Now step back and consider the broader arc. The war began with Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022 and has since become the central security crisis in Europe. Over nearly 4 years, both sides have adapted to new technologies, new tactics, and shifting external support. The human cost has been immense, and the economic cost has rippled through energy markets, defense budgets, and global politics. In that context, a framework that includes a full ceasefire only after all parties agree is both cautious and revealing. It suggests negotiators fear an early ceasefire that collapses before terms are settled. It also suggests that the hardest issues are being held until last, because once the guns fall silent, leverage changes, and the side that feels disadvantaged may try to reopen the deal. That is why the White House review of next steps matters. Washington is effectively deciding how much political capital, security commitment, and economic promise it is willing to attach to this framework, and what consequences it is prepared to impose if it fails. If the White House moves too hard, it risks rupturing the coalition supporting Ukraine or provoking escalation. If it moves too softly, it risks producing an agreement that Russia can violate without cost. There is also the matter of credibility. Any security guarantee described as NATO-like will be scrutinized. Ukraine will want clarity. Russia will test boundaries. European capitals will demand consultation. And American politics will shape what is sustainable over years, not weeks. Peace is not a single signature. It is an ongoing commitment to enforcement, aid, and deterrence. And yet, for all the skepticism, this moment is still significant. Zelensky's willingness to publicly discuss mutual withdrawals and demilitarized zones under international monitoring and domestic approval is a signal. It does not mean Ukraine is conceding its claims. It means Kyiv is exploring a mechanism to stop the war without surrendering its sovereignty. Whether that mechanism survives contact with Russia's demands is the central question. So, tonight, here is what is confirmed. Ukraine has outlined a 20-point peace framework being discussed with the United States. Kyiv says many issues have moved closer, but territory and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant remain unresolved. U.S. envoys describe recent talks with Ukraine and European partners as productive and focused on sequencing, while separate discussions with a Russian envoy have been held. The Kremlin says Pavuzian has been briefed on U.S. proposals and that Moscow is formulating its position. And here is why it matters. If the White House can align Ukraine, Europe, and a workable enforcement architecture, the war could move toward a ceasefire with deterrence behind. If it cannot, the risk is a more prolonged war, a harsher winter for civilians, and a future settlement shaped not by diplomacy, but by exhaustion and force. The decisions made now will echo for decades in Europe's security order. What happens next will likely come in stages, not in a single dramatic announcement. A Russian reply, explicit or evasive. More meetings, perhaps at higher levels. Drafts refined, language tightened, red lines tested. And the battlefield, still loud, still unforgiving, still capable of derailing every diplomatic sentence with one night of strikes. In the end, the most important measure will be simple. Does this process reduce the violence in a way that lasts? Does it protect Ukraine from renewed invasion? Does it create a structure that punishes violations? And does it do so without rewarding the very act that started this war? For now, Ukraine is signaling a new peace push. The White House is reviewing next steps, and the world is watching whether this becomes the beginning of an end or just the latest chapter in a war that refuses to close.